Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by retired Chief Tim Eggebraaten. Chief, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity and I appreciate everything you're doing out there.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And you are the off-duty chief. That's where folks can find you. So we're going to go a little out of order and throw a little bit of your contact info out and like kind of a little bit of your brand. You're a speaker, you're an entertainer, you're a musician. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, it's people, when they see police officers, they just assume they know everything about us because we're in that uniform. And that's the whole purpose of the uniform, is to unite. And but we're human, right? We all have different skills and gifts that we've been given. And so music has been a huge part of my life, all of my life. I was whistling before I could speak, and I always have a tune in my head, and I love music. And so I was working nights, and we hired a one-man band for a neighborhood block party, and I thought, I could do that. Just playing every song I know. And so I just started doing some little one-man band things. And my weekends for 6.5 years were Mondays and Tuesdays. Those were my days off. And so I didn't do much of it, but then I started doing a little bit more. And I had one chief tell me, you have to decide if you want to be a musician or a cop. And I was like, well, why can't I do both? And what I found was that music broke down a lot of the barriers, where people that didn't like cops, they would tell me, I hate cops, but dang, that's a nice guitar. What do you got there? Or I love that song you just played. And so it broke down a lot of barriers. And so I started doing it as a one-man band, and then then it started exploding. And when I was police chief, I was doing about 130 shows a year and 4-hour gigs. And but I just found that with my wellness and my own mental health, that it gave me an opportunity to release that in a positive way. And it was just like, it was a game changer. Music has been and continues to be. So
yeah, I love that. And to zig a little bit, you talk about music being such a connector, and I love that, right? I think music's definitely been a big part of my life, in and out in different ways. But what a way to get some rapport going with even a suspect, right? Like, I just remember so many times you have this opportunity to ask the person in the back of the car what they want to listen to. I've certainly had some very contentious conversations and interactions with the person in the back of the car, where it was more about, I'm not going to entertain anything, but, man, what a way to bridge that and sometimes get some rapport going, right? Get some intel, get a statement, things like that. But then, to zag back, just to talk a little bit about what I know about you, is that there was a time where you drifted away from these things, right? And that's what you speak about a lot, right? This work-life balance, this connection to wellness. Can you tell me a little bit about that and where you may have lost sight of that, and how you refound things like music that made you, right? The human beneath the badge.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in a small town, about 400 people in Northwest Minnesota, and I started drinking alcohol at 12 years old. And it was helped me fit in what I felt like I was fitting in.
Was it kind of normal in your neighborhood back then? A pretty normal age?
It was normal in that group, but I don't know about other people, but other people, I'd look around at kids my age and I'd see them participating in things. But what I know now and didn't know then, that I was introverted, and that it was uncomfortable for me to break into a group setting like that. And now it isn't, because I understand where I'm coming from. But and so alcohol was that common denominator, when I brought that in, when I would drink with them, then the playing field was level, and we were all one. And so I started drinking at 12, but I knew I wanted to be a cop even before kindergarten. It was a calling, and worked in corrections for 3 years, and then started with the agency that in the town that I live in now, and was here for 25 years. But early on in my career, I started getting that us versus them mindset. I know you talk about that, and
Yeah,
it's just, and not everybody like recognizes that, but we all have it. We all have that
for
us
sure.
versus them mindset, especially in law enforcement. And what I don't say is, well, we can't not have it in law enforcement because it is sometimes us versus them. But how do we balance that with, like on that traffic stop, not just, you have to be safe, of course, but how do you balance that us versus them? So I was getting deep into that, and where it became my night shift patrol guys and myself. We were the us, and them included my administration, my supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
My sergeant had forgotten what it was like to be a real cop, and the chief was clueless, and that us versus them. And then as I advanced in my career and became them, when I
Mm-hmm.
when I was a sergeant, and then working in investigations, we used to ride the investigators all the time. Like, what are you guys doing all day?
Oh yeah, right. Like,
We're out
yeah,
here humping it hard.
investigations versus patrol, right?
Yeah, and even like blue versus brown, the sheriff's office or
Yeah.
the state patrol, and it was that us versus them, and it was, in my mind, it was getting out of control because it was like everybody was them except for my guys that I worked with on that night shift. And that's definitely not just a cop thing, but I see it really thick
Mm-hmm.
in law enforcement, and it's a dangerous mindset to to foster and to keep going. And so, but it was early on in my career that I met this older guy. He's kind of homeless, guy named Norman. And there's just something about Norman, nothing flashy. He was just a kind, gentle man, and he had these beautiful brown eyes, and just something soft about his eyes. And I don't know, but it was at a time in my career where I was deep into that us versus them, and I helped Norman get a hotel room for the night, and then he just vanished. And before he left, before we separated, he said, "Wait a minute," and he looked at me with those brown eyes. He said, "I want to remember the people who have helped me."
Hmm.
And Eric, I mean, you could have knocked me over with a feather. I mean, it hit me, and I didn't know what to say. And I got into my squad car, and I started to cry. And I thought, and I wasn't, I'm not against crying, but I just definitely didn't cry at that stage of my
Mm-hmm.
life. But it hit me that, who have I become, or who am I becoming? Because that was not the Tim Eggebraaten that Kenny and Pat Eggebraaten from Fisher, Minnesota raised to be caring and thoughtful and conscientious. And that wasn't the Tim Eggebraaten that in kindergarten wanted to be a cop in the worst way. It was a calling to help people like Norman. But somewhere early on in that career, I had started to just really get that crust, and that, us versus them, and I'm going to go out and thump and bump, and this is my thing. And the speed limit's 30, not 35 there, buckshot, slow down. And
Mm-hmm.
and I just had that knuckle dragging mentality. And
Yeah.
um but and Norman, just by being himself, this kind and gentle man, made me recognize that my rhythm was off, my rhythm of life was offbeat, and I had better start to do something about that, or I was going to be one of those burnouts that we all know. Or maybe we're getting into that stage of our career where we're starting to resent why we got into the career, or why did we do it, and regret it. And how do we get that rhythm back,
Yeah.
without just burning out and going off bitter.
Yeah, yeah. This evokes a few points in my mind. One, going back a little bit to that us versus them, and yeah, like there's just something innate. I think you're absolutely right. There's this tribalism that we all gravitate towards, and so we work so hard to get into this very this field that accepts so few, right? Like so few are even eligible for this background check and the abilities and the testing, and we should be proud of that. However, right, that it does evolve into this. Um, there's the fun aspect, right? The competitive nature, sheriff's office, all this, but then you do hear about the contentious cultures. You do see that in the news actually when and I won't say where. A number of years ago, you Google around, you can find examples of actual neighboring agencies that don't play well. Like
Yeah.
they actually get into stuff, or it's an off-duty engagement with an on-duty, and then it flips the next week. Um, Terrible, right? That's not good for anybody. It's super beyond corrosive. But I wonder how much even like the when you talk about that crust that develops, I think that is a part to some degree for everyone in their career when they go through a lot of the negative interactions and the trauma. I wonder how much of that is necessary for you to really reflect back and bounce back, right? And not everyone does, and that's a really unfortunate thing. And I'm glad that you're sharing this aspect of us versus them, where you become the them, and then as you promote all the way up to chief, you become a smaller and more even maybe more polarizing them because you're getting all the shots from everybody.
Yeah.
But I wonder how much of that is just a part of it.
Well, I think a lot of it is, and I went when I went up to police chief, and we were a small agency. We had at that time we had 14 cops, total, and so I was one of them for 25 years, and so one of the troops and newly chief of police, and I'm looking at the policy manual, and we have to update that, and like my first update, I had the union representative come in, and he was like, "We're not signing off on this." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, "Well, you could screw us on this." I'm like, "Well, look at me. It's
Yeah,
still me, you
yeah,
knucklehead. I mean, when have I ever tried to screw you?" And it floored me like that again, that union mentality. They were the us, and then all of a sudden now I'm them, and so it just like, who are you talking to? I would literally die for you, and here you're worried about me like gigging you on your mustache length or something stupid. I'm like,
yeah, yeah,
dude, and so that was like a big eye opener for me. But I think some of that, like you said, is some of it's necessary because we can't do a traffic stop at 2:30 in the morning and ask them for a hug. Driver's license and a hug, please. I mean, that's
right,
just ridiculous. But
yeah,
so you have to have some of that, balance it, and but yeah, it works so much better. And like, even like the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, I mean, they gig each other, they tease each other, but when it comes down to it, and even in law enforcement, when it comes down and there's a citywide emergency, then it's like, I don't care what color your uniform is, we're together. And that's when the brotherhood and the sisterhood really get strong. And so that kind of mentality, then that's when it's like, okay, let's band together, and then it's still us versus them, but it's like important. And so finding that whole balance, and that's what I've dedicated now in the last 7 years to trying to because it's not just law enforcement, it's nurses versus their administration, it's teachers, it's
hmm
parents versus their kids, and the kids are wondering like, mom and dad are clueless, and they don't know what it's like to be me. And so it's everywhere. Politics, of course, now it's an election year, and we're going to see more of that coming up. And so it's just that,
yeah.
let's
My
have the
goodness, the
conversation.
headlines that come out right now.
Yeah, and let's just keep the conversation going, though. Be genuinely curious and recognize in yourself that maybe you don't have all the answers, and maybe if I'm going to ask you a question about what it's like in Washington, instead of me just like waiting for you to answer so I can pounce on that and say,
hmm
yeah, but what do
Um,
you think? I think, don't you think, and so it's
Yeah, that's
powerful.
such a yeah. I want to focus in on that because we talk about shoot, even when you're talking about the union guy, when you're the new chief, and this us versus them, but really to bridge that, just have communications, right? You didn't become an enemy overnight, just by virtue of your position. You're a
Right.
person that's demonstrated certain characteristics, right? And then even when you're telling that story, it made me think about emotional intelligence, and then how that is becoming an emerging theme within leadership training, which is fantastic, right? Because you're ultimately working with a bunch of individuals with a bunch of different prerogatives and personalities and communication styles, and just to be aware of that, right? And that brings me to why, you mentioning being curious kind of lit a spark within my brain, is that yes, I think that is part of the secret sauce, right? When we're building empathy, when we're communicating with others, whether they're, within the job, within the occupation, or members of the public who are literally everybody, by staying curious is the only way you can really be open-minded. And I love how you really address that, where it's, I'm not just going to be curious to find out how I can defeat you in a debate. No, it's just genuinely to learn about someone, where they're coming from, and then you just let it sit there, let it
Yeah.
marinate, so you can hopefully try to get to some middle ground.
Yeah. I used to have a thing about tattoos, like especially like facial and neck
Mm,
tattoos, and where I would assume automatically that I know everything about that person. And I know nothing. It's just like them looking at a uniform and people saying, "Well, I know all about you because you're a cop." But
sure.
so then what I started to do is when I would start to feel that way, if there was an opportunity, I would approach that person and say, just curious, do you remember what your first tattoo was? And they always, 100% of the time, they light up because it's like, well, yeah, I was 16. I
Mm,
had to sneak out of the house and I can't show you because it's in a really weird spot. And, but and each tattoo has a story. And then when I'm sitting there and then listening to that, then it's like, okay, then it just like solidifies in my brain that I had no clue. Any assumption that I had about that person just went out the window because I was completely wrong. And then we have this beautiful, like, 1 minute conversation. And then I learn a little bit more about them. And then they're like, cool, this dude, this old gray haired guy actually listened to me and recognized me. So that was pretty cool.
yeah, no, that's fantastic. I want to go back and talk about Norman a little bit.
Yeah.
Could you remind me, you might have said it, but when in your career did Norman intersect with your life?
It was early. It was, probably within the first, I was still working nights regularly. So it was probably 5 or 6 years into my career. So I was really good at it, working nights, and you get that night vision, and you just have that. I mean, everything was tuned in, and I could see people running across the street behind me 3 blocks, and it's just like, and you get good and you get really good at it at reading people. And but then I was kind of had that swagger going, where I was
Mhm,
in that part of my career where moving and grooving. I was a non-formal or informal leader on my night shift, and very aggressive. And so when Norman, and it was a call that came in, and my dispatcher's voice matched my attitude because we
mm,
feed off each other, right, on that whatever shift we're working or who we're hanging out with. And his voice was like, "Yeah, go to the Holiday Inn, check out this guy, figure out what he needs, and move him along." And I'm like, 10-4. You know, I'm I'm this
yeah,
bad cop in the mean streets of Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, and so I got there, and he just right away. I mean, he'd lost his jacket. It was just simple things. He was confused clearly, but he was not a danger to himself or anybody else. And he was on his way to Detroit, Michigan from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And on the way, he went by Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, so about 900 miles short of Detroit, Michigan. He thought he was there
mm,
and got off at Walmart and lost his jacket. And somebody recognized he needed some help, so they gave him a ride to the Holiday Inn. And so that's where I met him. And there was nothing spectacular about the guy. He was just a guy in his mid 60s. And what's cool about Norman is that there are so many Normans and Normas that are in our lives every single day. And
mhm,
I've had big city cops when I'm talking with organizations, big city cops that'll say, "Well, it's nice, Tim, that you had this opportunity with Norman, but we don't have the time. We're 6 calls deep all the time." I'm like, brother, they're still there. They're
mhm,
that fifth call out of your sixth call, the person that you're picking up off the ground or whatever, that could be the Norman. These people that there's something about them And if you stop and slow your mind down enough and you recognize that the whatever it is about that person, maybe you don't know what it is, maybe it's something they say or do, or but just something. And for my Norman, it was his eyes, and I can't explain it, I can't put it into words, but there was just something about his brown eyes that when he looked at me, it felt like he was looking into my soul,
Mm.
and it startled me, and it just like it shook me, and to the point where I started to cry in my squad car. And I think about him a lot, but these people that are put into our lives, and Eric, like with the social media, and that's where I first saw you through LinkedIn and what you're doing in your podcast. You are a Norman for so many people, and the officer that's listening to your podcast at 2 o'clock in the morning with their earbuds, and they're in their squad car, and they're who knows, if they're going to be a Norman or a Norma for somebody, but whoever your guest is, that might be the moment in their career, in their life, where they're like, man, this is a puzzle piece I needed. I needed this wake up call. I'm not fun to be around. My significant other can't stand me because I'm irritable, and I go home and kick the cat after work, and I'm drinking too much and all that stuff. But so we all have the opportunity or the obligation to be that person that other people look at, and they see what we're typing in our keyboards, and they hear what's coming out of our mouths, and they just say, you know what? I don't really know what it is about that person, but there's something about them that makes me reflect on myself, that I want to I want to have a better attitude on this. And we can't
Yeah.
control that. We get
Yeah.
we get roped in thinking that this is who we are, my personality, it's the way I was raised. But like 40 to 60% of our personalities are malleable. We can intentionally change them.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to start back is like, yeah, you were in that phase, and I think that that's common for a lot of people, right? You had about 5 or so years on, you had confidence, you had competence, and then it bleeds over into the swagger that you talked about, right? And for a lot of folks, that becomes this sense of being untouchable and maybe even complacent. And you could be complacent with officer safety, you could be complacent with emotions, where you're just guarded, right? You're just you're callous already. But yeah, something with Norman hit you, and a lot of people from the outside that are faithful would probably label Norman as a guardian angel, to be able to flip you just with a look, and then have this evoked emotion within you to reflect essentially on the course of your life, right? And you talk
Right.
about how you thought about how your folks didn't raise you to be this type of Tim. I certainly reflected and have spoken a lot about when I became super callous, super cynical within my first few years, and I am super grateful for that, right? I think about that because I have a marker in which I have to recognize, like, I'm not going back there again. And I feel very grateful that I did it before I was married. I did it before I had a kid. And so hopefully, I'm doing all the right things, and listening to folks like you, talking to folks like you, to your point later, is when someone else is listening in. I mean, that is really the stuff. I think that's really the purpose of why we have the conversations we're having, is recognizing and speaking to other podcasters such as Chris Luttrell. Shout out to Chris. The Gravity podcast is, sometimes we do ask ourselves, like, is it worth it? Like, why do we put in all this work, and we got to take time away from the family? Well, because we believe in what we're saying, and how I might reach somebody is different than how you may, right? And someone might be just about ready to quit the podcast, and they listen to, retired Chief Tim Eggebraaten, and they're like, no, I'm back in. And actually, I got to find this guy. I
Yeah.
got to see what he's doing on YouTube. So I love that point, and thank you so much for the tall praise and compliment.
Yeah. No, it's and we get in our own head so much, and that whether it's us versus them, or how we're going to handle, people say, well, when you get home from wherever you're working or whatever you're doing, wipe your feet off on the doormat before you go in and leave your work at work. Well, that's bullcrap. I mean, it doesn't work that
doesn't
way.
doesn't
And it
work.
would be great if it did, but it
Yeah.
doesn't. And so we have to find a way. So for me, like, I'm 57 right now. I retired right at 50. And because I would always tell people, like, change your path if you don't like your path. And that's really easy to say. It's a lot tougher to do. But I was blessed to have two callings. I knew I was going to be a cop at a young age. And right before I retired, I found motivational, inspirational speaking. And it was, so I'm able to travel around the country now with my guitar and share stories and share experiences and share tactics. Like, well, we prepare cops, we do the pursuit driving, we do all the one arm takedowns and handcuffing techniques and taser and all that stuff. But we're getting better though, aren't we, Eric? I mean, as a profession, we're getting better at even acknowledging it, where when I started it was definitely suck it up, buttercup, and
Hmm.
this is just the way it is, and move on with your day. But the reality is we're dealing with stuff that most people hopefully never ever have to deal with, and we do it regularly. And so it's but when I retired, I started writing, and that really helped me to unwind my whole self. Like,
Hmm.
okay, well, why do I do the things? Why did I drink so much? And I got arrested a year after I retired from law enforcement for a DWI, driving while intoxicated. Uh, and so that was another wake up call for me that, like, okay, dude, you are in a spiral. And I wasn't dealing with the 28 years of trauma. And I was dealing with it through alcohol.
Yeah.
And so it was a slow learner. And so I started writing, and then I wrote this book called Find Your Beat, Walk in the Rhythm of Life. And it's so amazing how it's having an impact, like your podcast, and my hope is that when people read it, they glean certain information out of it, and it's hitting different people. And it was scary to write, and when I wrote it, and it was like very personal, and I thought, this is stupid, I'm not an author, but I did it. I pushed through that. And about 3 days after it was open to the public, I got a call from a police chief from a pretty big agency. He said, brother, thank you. I needed this, and then now, since then, it's been, I get these messages from people just like you do, that, you're doing it. You're showing up, you're being consistent on your podcast, and you're doing right by it. But then all of a sudden, somebody out of the blue will say, like the words, you've changed my life. And I know you've heard that somebody's saying, you've changed my life. And it's like, okay, well, I'm all in again then.
Yeah.
And we all have gifts. Each and every one of us has a gift. And whoever's listening to this podcast right now has a gift. Identify it and get after sharing that gift. And
Yeah.
it's when you reflect out, and you, instead of like soaking it all in, like, oh, poor me, I haven't gotten a raise in 3 years, or poor me, I'm working the night shift still, or, and you're focused on you. When you turn that around and you focus on other people and what you can do to help them, then it's a game changer.
Yeah, very well said. And shout out to Clay Surratt, who was on the podcast in the early days. He brought up that service is oftentimes the best medicine, right? Paying attention to others, and then with that, you take ownership, right? It's something that
Mm.
you are doing for others, and that pays back into yourself. You brought up alcohol. What was or were some of the big things that helped you through that?
Well, jail, spending the night in jail was a big
Doesn't help
one.
everybody. That's good to hear. That's good to hear.
And then calling my wife,
Mm,
and she knew right away as soon as I called her. And we've been married now, well, in June it'll be 35 years. And
congrats.
and so calling her, and her knowing just by me calling, and she knew right away. And I think our lives are full of puzzle pieces, and each stage of our life, or each day, there's a piece getting put onto that puzzle. And so for my relationship with alcohol, they were all these puzzle pieces throughout, 51 years, or well, from 12 to 51. And So it was all these puzzle pieces getting put in, and it was that final arrest. And I was thankful that I didn't have a physical addiction. I never went through withdrawals or anything like that. But I was the party guy, and I'd go to conferences, cop conferences. I was a canine handler for 7 years,
Oh
and
no. Oh
yeah,
no.
and you go to these USPCA
Yeah.
canine dealios, and you're with your brothers and sisters, and you have that common bond, and yeah, and it was game on, and because again, I felt like, here I am hanging out with St. Paul PD or LAPD canine handlers, and who am I? I'm just a guy, and to equalize it, I would, grab a Miller Lite and start pounding them, or a Crown
Hmm.
Royal, and just like, and then it was in my mind, I felt like, well, now I can talk to these guys because I'm one, and at Chiefs conferences, I'm hanging out with big city police chiefs, and I'm thinking, I can't even polish their badge, or tie their shoes, and who am I? And the reality is that I did earn my seat at the table, but in my mind, I was thinking, man, I'm gonna have to have a drink in my hand, and if I'm gonna approach these guys. And then when I was doing my music gigs, every single gig involved alcohol. I thought it was part and parcel to what I was doing. That if I'm gonna have a party with these guys and do music, I better be drinking, a lot. And so I was thankful that the quitting part physically was no problem. It was just that I had thought it had become such a part of my identity. And then when I did quit, and then I was doing some music gigs with no alcohol, and then it was like, okay, well, it's not about me, and people were not coming up and saying, "Hey, man, why aren't you drinking?" And they were just fine with it. But in my head, I was making it a much bigger deal, and so I was thankful for that. That it was pretty seamless. And then my music gigs improved a thousandfold.
Oh
I
wow.
can't imagine traveling the country now like I do for speaking if I was drinking still, and getting on a 5 a.m. flight and hungover. And I
Hmm.
don't miss those days. And I'm definitely not one to be like thumping and bumping saying that, don't drink, don't do this, don't, because it's each person has to find their, um, I always think of like Frank Reagan on Blue Bloods, and how he'd get home and have his whatever scotch or something, and he'd have one drink and then it'd be done, and or not even finish it, And I always envied that, like to have that one. But to me, it wasn't just one, and it was
Sure.
like it was medicinal and not in a good way. So
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that. That's a lot. You cover a lot of ground, and even the I really was laughing with the canine part because being a prior canine handler, yeah, conferences it's a thing. It's a thing with cop training in general. And before outsiders get super judgy, like I knew it, all cops drink to excess. It's like it's not really that, but it is this excitement and this buzz about being able to network and connect with like-minded folks. And then you get people telling war stories, and then you get, someone gets a keg, and there's a keg at the conference, and then we're, and then it's very much on its way. But you spoke on something that I think is huge, is that this sense of imposter syndrome, right? And you are a retired chief of a small town, small agency, but let's be frank, and there's a lot of leaders that listen in on this. There's a lot of uh, developing leaders that are listening in on this. Being an administrator in a small town is not easier than being an administrator in a big town. It's very different, right? And there's towns where you're the sergeant and you're basically the assistant chief, right? And so that is a different type of role with more complications than, a mid-sized agency like my own. However, when I was a sergeant, and a lot of the guys I work with that are first line supervisors in my mid-sized agency, I mean, they're handling a lot of administrative tasks that a big city, like an NYPD, LAPD, like a sergeant is literally just like a kind of a scene supervisor, right? Like just kind of looking out for things that might be missed, right? Hey, can you go grab the crime scene tape? Cool. Like that's a boss, but it's very different. So, um, but even for you to relay that, I think, is powerful, right? Like, because here we are that aren't chiefs are listening in, and we would not presume something about you because you're a chief in a small town, but here you are, recognizing that you felt that.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's very powerful that we need to recognize what we bring, why we bring it, and give ourselves that validation that sometimes we're not willing to give ourselves that credit, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there were in our agency, in our community, I was wearing the white shirt, chief of police. But I would go, my one of my first staff meetings that we had when I was chief of police, we gathered everybody in, and during that day, there was an ongoing, active, like looking for a woman that was in danger. And right before the meeting started, we did a search warrant, so I'm right there, and it was she had been killed, and the killer tried to take himself out, and it was going to be it was an attempted murder suicide, and so here we are. So I'm the public information officer. I'm the second guy through the door, on the search warrant, and find her, and so we're doing all of this, and then trying to regroup and then meet with the media, and so all of those things, get our Bureau of Criminal Apprehension on the horn to come up and help us investigate, and deal with the crime scene, all that stuff. And but I loved it. I mean, I loved it at the time. But yeah, that imposter syndrome is huge, and it doesn't matter if you're in Mayberry and you're Andy Griffith or you're in the NYPD or wherever you're at. We get that idea in our head that we're not to some level, or we compare ourselves like, well, I'll never be an Eric Tung, it's like, well, but Eric is Eric,
Yeah.
so when we stop, I just saw an old clip too, from a musician that he was basically saying, be inspired by people, but don't be in awe of them, like look at them and be inspired. But if you get in awe and you're just sitting back thinking, well, I'll never have a podcast as successful as Blue Grit Radio, so I'm not even going to try, and but you don't know, and so
Hmm.
like, and you said it before, like different voices and different mediums are gonna, I found you through LinkedIn, and it's different ways to get that voice out there, and the message isn't new. None of
Hmm.
this is new that we're talking about. Uh, but it's we need to keep that conversation going because it's going to resonate with somebody that needs to hear it right now and today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's so much to that, right? Like, be inspired by others. And I've more recently reflected on this where early in my career, I was trying to be this kind of cop. I was trying to emulate, Tom Reener, like people that worked with me, like would know. And then I was trying to emulate a different aspect of, Bill Blowers, and kind of get these little pieces. And when I was really just directly trying to be that person, that's where I'd fail utterly. Like, I'm not those men. I'm
Right.
not those people. And ultimately, I couldn't be that kind of cop. But what I could do is take things from them, like their enthusiasm or their devotion to learning craft, like tactics or something like that, and then try to learn from that and emulate that passion, right? But certainly not the exact style. Like, I can't be that person. And where I've definitely found myself elevating to a better cop, a better leader, a better person is when I'm just acknowledging that a lot of the things that make me me, I'm allowing myself to be that, right? And a lot of those things aren't traditionally associated with being a cop. Similar to you, right? Like, when you fell back into music, that was always a part of your life. You were you.
Yeah.
But creative energy isn't typically something we associate with police work. But the flip, without going down a tangent, is I think that by applying our creative brains, for those of us that recognize there's creativity everywhere within us, that's how we're going to innovate. That's how we're going to get past a lot of the challenges that we're facing. It's going to take looking at things a different way, right? Being curious, to go back to that notion. Um, so I love a lot about what you talked about, and it's almost this sense of, to be inspired by others. uh, it makes me think about that adage, like, don't meet your heroes, because
Yeah.
ultimately when we put people on a pedestal, we get super disappointed. I'm very much that way, right? There's definitely been people either celebrities or historical figures or people in my life where, as I learned more and more about them and I got so jazzed about it, I got instantly disappointed when I learned something unfavorable. But again, what that revealed to me was that I came from a very judgmental place,
Mhm.
with really high expectations. But ultimately, we're all humans. Like we're all doing the best we can with what we have, generally in the moment. But I love how you spoke to a lot of that, which really just to me harkens back to how we just need to remember like who we are as people, as human beings, and police work is very much a piece of that, but it can't be everything.
Right. Well, even Norman, when I was doing the research for my book and trying to track down his family, and I found like a grandnephew or something of his that said Norman was a piece of crap. He was a horrible father, horrible grandfather. Please don't write about him. And I respected that opinion of this relative of his. But regardless of Norman's entire life, for the 45 minutes or whatever that I was encountering him, he rocked my world. And
Hmm.
he helped me get on a better path. And so I will never forget that. And but yeah, I didn't know the entirety of the man, but then I found out he was a Korean War veteran, and he is buried with honors in Fort Snelling Cemetery in Minneapolis. And it's like, yes, there's a man that served his country, and he rocked my world. That's what I know. And
Yeah.
but yeah, he wasn't perfect. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. And it's like, so yeah, let's glean from Norman his kindness and his just his being him, and not get hung up in the weeds that he had made some mistakes or he had some mental health issues. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. And I think that there's a personal reflection that will help everybody is that, we can't judge anybody by one sole instance, or we certainly shouldn't, right? And that's even ourselves. Like, I think we can all go down the rabbit hole of the times that we made our biggest mistakes, where we are the most ashamed, but we can't make that, we can't let that be like I suppose, the symbol or like the real image of our whole lives. Like that's certainly unfair. And if you thought about that with your loved ones, you would certainly say, no, like everyone makes mistakes, everyone's human. But I think what a powerful thing, not to erase some of Norman's mistakes for his own family, but certainly for you, it's a ability to say, hey, we can all have an opportunity in a moment, and that can be with ourselves, that can be seeing that in somebody else. And it's to me, that speaks to redemption. And I think that it is a time where we need to offer grace. We just need to offer more grace, and that's
Mhm.
to others, and that's certainly to ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Chief, it's we've covered a lot of ground, and I certainly want to be respectful of your time. You're hitting the road later today. Can you please summarize for the folks listening? I know we talked about a lot of big themes, but what would you leave the listeners with? And please tell everybody where they can find you on social media and what you're up to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest takeaway is, for me anyway, to relay to your listeners, is to try to shift your focus away from yourself, focus on other people, the people that you're helping. Even if it's the person that's the fourth call this week on the same person, uh, try to look at that from a different perspective, maybe from their perspective. And so when we do that, when we um, pull ourselves out of our own head. And one way that I like to do that is to write a letter of gratitude, like physically write it with pen and paper, of somebody that's inspired me. And when I do that, it just releases these chemicals inside of me. And they've done studies on that compare the effects of letter writing of gratitude to effects of Prozac, on our
Mm,
own well-being. And so I would just suggest maybe doing something like that. Maybe start with 6 people in your life that have inspired you. And what if you committed to writing one letter a week for 6 weeks, to these people? And it's, for us, for men especially, I'm going to throw us under the bus. It seems like that's really hard
yeah.
to do. Hey, dude, you rock. But when you do that and you get more into the habit, it gets better and it gets more profound. So I would just say try that. Challenge you. 6 people, we'll let her a week for 6 weeks. Yeah, people can find me on my website, offdutychief.com. I have some music that's out there on all the streaming devices, and if they just search for Tim Eggebraaten, the spelling gets a lot of people, trust me. And I have some YouTube stuff out there, and my book is available. It's called Find Your Beat, Walk in the Rhythm of Life. It's available on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or anywhere you get your books. Um, yeah, and if you have any questions, like you, I'm really easy to get a hold of, and through LinkedIn or Facebook, or I don't do whatever Twitter's called now. I have never got into that,
X.
but
Yeah.
Instagram, whatever. I mean, it's
Yeah.
smoke signals. I'll respond to anything.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Chief Tim Eggebraaten. So it is Eggebraaten, correct?
Perfect.
Fantastic. And that'll be in the show notes, folks. So thank you again so much. Off duty Chief Tim Eggebraaten.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.